A man builds a life with his own hands. But some things, no matter how strong, still break. My name is Finn Douglas. I'm 52 years old, and I've spent my life working to forge my grandfather built. Ironwood Hollow isn't much, just a tight-knit town where a man's word still means something, where a handshake seals a deal better than any contract. My forge sits at the center of it, the same way my fathers did before me, the way his fathers did before him. Fire, steel, and sweat. That's how I've made my living. That's how I built everything I have. I come home covered in soot most nights, my arms lined with burns earned from years at the anvil. That never bothered Delilah. When we were younger, she used to say I smelled like iron and firewood, that it reminded her of home. But these days, she barely looks at me when I walk through the door. The house is quiet when I step inside, just the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. No smell of dinner on the stove, no music playing from the old radio she likes. I glance at the coat rack, her jacket's gone. Again. I scrape my boots off by the door, shaking off the cold. Hector Fisher, my neighbor, had told me the first frost was coming in, and he wasn't wrong. Best get your wood chopped, Finn, he'd said that morning, wiping dirt from his hands as he tended to his garden. Cold's creeping in fast this year. Delilah used to care about things like that, making sure the house was stocked up before the deep freeze set in. Lately, she'd been too busy clearing her head. That's what she called it when she took off without saying where she was going. I head to the kitchen and pour myself a glass of water, my hands still stiff from the forge. There's a note on the counter, written in her neat, looping handwriting. Went for a walk. Don't wait up. I crumple it in my fist. Outside, the street lamps cast long shadows on the road. I step out onto the porch, arms crossed, watching the town settle into the evening. Across the way, Jay Stewart's perched on his usual spot, strumming his guitar. He's always out there playing something, never the same tune twice. He sees me watching and tips his hat. Evening, Finn. Ain't it a fine night? I nod. Bit cold. Ah, but that's what makes it good. Cold keeps a man sharp. He grins, picking at the strings. Saw Delilah earlier. Over at the lantern. She looked, deep in thought. I glanced toward the cafe down the road, the one with the big bay windows and the soft yellow light that spills onto the sidewalk. I know who she's with before Jace even has to say it. He keeps strumming, eyes on his guitar. Funny thing, though. She used to look at you like that. I don't answer. Just step back inside, close the door behind me, and sit at the table. The crumpled note is still there, staring back at me like it means something. I don't know when it started, but I know what it is. A man doesn't need to be told when something's broken. He just knows. I sat there for a long time, just staring at the note. There wasn't any anger, not yet. Just a slow, grinding weight in my chest. The kind you feel when something's shifting under your feet and you don't know yet if it'll hold or if you'll fall straight through. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight. She still wasn't home. I wasn't the kind of man to ask where my wife was every second of the day. Never needed to before. She used to be waiting for me at the end of it, a book in her lap, a quiet smile when I walked in. That had been years ago, though. Now, I didn't even know what she was reading anymore. I stood, grabbed my coat, and stepped outside. Ironwood Hollow was mostly asleep, save for a few lights still on in the windows. I took the road down toward the Lantern Cafe, my boots crunching against the cold dirt. The place was still open, warm light spilling out through the big glass windows. Inside, a few stragglers sat nursing cups of coffee. And there she was, in the far corner. Delilah wasn't looking at her drink. She was looking at him, Grayson Turner. I'd seen him around town before, always with a book in his hand, always with that quiet, thoughtful look that made women lean in when he talked. He gave lectures at the library, wrote articles about the history of the town, that kind of thing. He was a man who spoke in soft tones and careful words, someone who didn't have calluses on his hands, someone who never had to wipe sweat from his eyes because of honest work. Delilah was talking, her hands moving in small, animated gestures. She used to talk to me like that. Now, she was looking at Grayson like he had all the answers in the world. I didn't go in. Didn't need to. I'd seen enough. I turned and walked back the way I came, past Jace, who was still playing his guitar outside. He watched me, his fingers never missing a note. He didn't say anything this time. Maybe he saw what I had. Maybe he'd already known. When I got home, I took off my coat, washed my hands, and sat back at the table. The note was still there. I unfolded it, smoothed it out. Don't wait up. I set it down and reached for the stack of paperwork in the drawer. The divorce forms had been there for a while now, just waiting. I hadn't signed them yet because some part of me still held on to what we used to be, to the Delilah I'd married. But that woman wasn't sitting at the lantern tonight. I picked up a pen, flipped to the first page, and signed my name. The papers sat on the table for 2 days before I took them to the courthouse. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't second thoughts. It was calculation. A man doesn't swing his hammer until he knows exactly where the strike will land. I needed to be sure the blow would be clean. Delilah didn't notice the papers when she came home late that night. Or maybe she did, and just chose to ignore them. I didn't ask where she'd been. Didn't need to. She moved around the house careful-like, avoiding my eyes, speaking only when necessary. Morning came, and she left early, saying something about needing to clear her head. By noon, I was standing in front of the clerk at the courthouse. The woman at the desk looked over the paperwork, glanced at me once, then started stamping the forms. No questions, no sympathy, just business. When it was done, I walked out into the cold and didn't look back. The first person I ran into was Hector Fisher. He was loading sacks of feed into the back of his truck outside the general store, his thick arms straining under the weight. He caught sight of me, nodded once. "Cold morning," he said, wiping his hands on his overalls. "Yep." Hector took a long look at me, then at the courthouse behind me. He let out a breath, shaking his head. "Well, hell, guess I saw it coming." I said nothing, just waited. He leaned against the truck, arms crossed. "Delilah's been running round town like a woman with her head in the clouds. You know how people talk. Ain't much that stays a secret in a place like this." I nodded. "I know." Hector didn't press. That's what I liked about the man. He didn't offer pity, didn't dig for details. He just stood there for a minute, looking out at the street like he had all the time in the world. Then he sighed. "You let me know if you need anything." I gave him a nod, then kept walking. Back at the forge, the fire was already going. My apprentice, Daniel, was hammering out the shape of a horseshoe, his movement steady but a little hesitant. He was young, still learning. I watched for a minute, then stepped beside him, grabbing another piece of metal and setting it in the flames. "Angle's too shallow," I said. Daniel nodded, adjusting his grip. "Yes, sir." We worked in silence for a while, just the sound of steel meeting steel, the fire roaring behind us. It was steady, solid. It was the only thing in my life that hadn't changed. At some point, Daniel hesitated. I saw it in the way his hammer slowed, how his eyes flicked toward me like he was debating whether to speak. Finally, he said, "Heard about Miss Delilah." I didn't stop working. "That's so." He swallowed, adjusting the horseshoe on the anvil. "Yeah, just people talk." I nodded once. "Let him." That was the end of that. By the time the sun started sinking, my hands were raw, my muscles burning from the day's work. I didn't mind. Work kept a man grounded. Work didn't betray you. I banked the fire, set the tools aside, and wiped the sweat from my brow. When I stepped outside, the air was sharp, the sky streaked with the last of the day's light. Across the street, Jace was tuning his guitar. He spotted me, gave me a lazy grin. "Evenin', Finn." "Evenin'." Jace plucked a few notes, then tilted his head. "She know yet. She'll figure it out." He chuckled. "Bet she will." He strummed a slow, thoughtful tune, watching me the way a man watches a storm roll in. "You don't look angry." I shrugged. "Ain't worth the effort." Jace nodded, as if he understood something most people didn't. "You're a different kind of man, Finn." I didn't know about that. I just knew that some things weren't worth chasing. I left him there, playing his song, and walked home. The house felt quieter than usual. Delilah wasn't back yet. I didn't wait up. I slept deep, the way a man sleeps when he knows he made the right call. Delilah found the papers the next morning. I was at the forge when she came in, still in her coat, her face pale from the cold or the shock. I couldn't tell which. She stood in the doorway, the papers clenched in her hand, her knuckles white. The fire behind me cast long shadows over the anvil, the heat rolling off in waves. But she was the one who looked like she was burning. "You're serious," she said, voice tight. I lifted the hammer, brought it down against the glowing metal. The impact rang out sharp and clear, cutting through the space between us. I didn't look up. Wouldn't have signed him if I wasn't. She took a step closer, her boots scuffing against the stone floor. "Finn, we should talk about this." I turned the metal with the tongs, set it back in the fire. "We could have talked before you started sneaking around town with him." Her breath hitched. It wasn't she stopped herself. Probably realized there wasn't a lie in the world that would hold up. She tried again. "I never meant to hurt you." I looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't the same woman I married, not anymore. Maybe I wasn't the same man either. I wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of my arm, leaned against the workbench. Delilah, I've spent my whole damn life working with fire. You think I don't know what happens when something's too weak to hold? She swallowed, glancing at the papers again. Finn, please. I shook my head. Ain't nothing left to say. She lingered there for a moment like she wanted to argue, but we both knew it wouldn't change a thing. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and turned on her heel, walking out just as quick as she came. The forge stayed hot the rest of the day. I worked harder than usual, keeping my hands busy, keeping my mind from drifting. By the time I banked the fire and locked up, the sky had turned a deep blue, the kind that only shows up right before the night swallows it whole. Hector was outside his house when I walked past, trimming back the last of his tomato plants. He looked up, gave me a nod. She find him? Yeah. He grunted. How'd that go? Like you'd expect. Hector wiped his hands on his flannel, looking at me the way a man looks at an old barn, checking to see if the foundation still held. After a minute, he nodded to himself. You want a beer? I thought about it, then shook my head. Not tonight. He didn't push, just patted the side of his truck and muttered, Doors open if you change your mind. I kept walking. The street was mostly empty, save for Jay strumming his guitar near the cafe. He wasn't playing anything in particular, just soft, wandering notes that barely carried in the cold air. As I passed, he didn't look up, just said, Heard she's staying at the Turner place. I didn't break stride. Figures. Jace let out a low whistle, plucking a few more notes. Ain't the move I would have made, but hey, romantics like to dig their own graves. I didn't answer. I just kept walking. By the time I got home, the house was empty, just like I knew it would be. I stood there for a minute, looking at the space where Delilah's books used to be, where her coat should have been hanging. The absence didn't sting. It just felt like a door closing, quiet and final. I grabbed a beer from the fridge, sat at the kitchen table, and took a slow sip. The papers were still there where she'd left them, creased from where she'd held them too tight. I reached over, picked up the pen, and signed the last page. It was done. The divorce went through quicker than I expected. No drawn-out fights, no screaming matches. Just signatures, paperwork, and a finality that settled in like cooling steel. Delilah didn't contest anything, didn't even ask for much. Maybe she thought she'd get what she needed from Turner. Maybe she thought it would all turn out the way she'd pictured in that dreamy little head of hers. I didn't think about it much. Didn't have to. I had work to do. The forge stayed busy. Orders kept coming in from farmers needing plowshares repaired, ranchers needing horseshoes, builders needing nails and hinges. My apprentice, Daniel, was getting better, his strikes more sure, his hands steadier. Some days I barely had to correct him, just let him work while I focused on my own pieces. A month passed. Then another. Delilah was still in town, but I didn't see her much. I heard things, though. Hector was the first to mention it, sitting across from me in the diner one morning over black coffee and eggs. Heard Turner's in some trouble, he said, tapping his spoon against the rim of his cup. I tore a piece off my toast, not looking up. That's so? Hector smirked. Seems like some folks started poking into his work. Turns out a lot of what he wrote wasn't exactly his. That got my attention. I set my coffee down. Plagiarist? Hector nodded, leaning back in the booth. Yeah, couple of university types sniffing around. Word is, a publisher dropped his latest book deal, and some folks in his circle ain't too happy with him. I thought about that for a moment, then nodded. Interesting. Hector watched me, chewing on the end of his toothpick. Don't suppose you had anything to do with that? I met his gaze, took a slow sip of my coffee, and let the silence do the talking. He huffed out a laugh. Yeah, thought so. A week later, I saw Delilah for the first time since she left. She was standing outside the lantern, arms crossed tight against the cold, watching the street like she was waiting for something or someone. She looked thinner, more tired. I didn't slow down. Just kept walking past her like she was any other person in town. She called out my name, quiet but firm. I stopped but didn't turn around. Finn, she tried again. Can we talk? I turned then, keeping my face unreadable. About what? Her throat bobbed as she swallowed, her fingers gripping the sleeves of her coat. I didn't think it would be like this. I didn't answer. Just waited. She shifted on her feet, glancing toward the cafe window. Grayson's struggling. He made some mistakes. People are turning on him. It's been hard. I let that sit between us for a second, then said, not my concern. Something flickered in her eyes, Regret? Maybe. Or realization? She nodded, looking down at the ground. No, I suppose not. I tipped my head slightly. Take care, Delilah. Then I walked away. That night, I got a bottle of good bourbon, sat out on the porch, and poured myself a drink. The air was cold, but the fire inside me burned steady. I wasn't bitter. Wasn't angry. Just settled. I'd done the right thing. And Delilah? She'd made her choices. Now she had to live with them. The cold wind carried the sound of Jace's guitar from down the street, a slow, wandering tune that drifted over the town like a man humming to himself when there was nothing left to say. I sat on the porch, the weight of the glass in my hand steady, the bourbon burning slow and warm in my chest. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that used to feel empty but now felt like something I'd earned. Delilah didn't come around again after that day outside the cafe. Maybe she finally understood there was nothing left to fix, no going back to how things were. Turner's troubles only got worse. Publishers dropped him. His name started popping up in articles that didn't paint him as the thoughtful historian he pretended to be, and before long, he was gone. No goodbyes, no explanations. Just packed up and left town like a man running from a fire he couldn't put out. I didn't ask where Delilah ended up after that. Didn't much care. The forge stayed busy. Daniel was nearly working at my level now, his hands sure, his strikes clean. The kid had promise. One day, I figured I'd hand the business down to him, keep the Douglas name alive in the way that mattered, not through mistakes of the past, but through the work, through the steel and fire that had kept men like me standing when everything else cracked under the weight. One evening, as I locked up the forge, Hector came by, hands tucked into his pockets, his breath misting in the cold air. He looked at me, then at the sign above the shop, nodding to himself. Thinking about retirement yet? I huffed. A man like me doesn't retire. Hector grinned, pulling a cigar from his coat and rolling it between his fingers. No, I guess he doesn't. But he does plan ahead. I knew what he was getting at. I'd been thinking about it myself. The forge wasn't just mine. It was something bigger than me, something that had stood for generations. It needed to keep standing, even when my hands weren't the ones holding the hammer. A few weeks later, I made it official, set up a fund for apprentices, young men who wanted to work with their hands, who needed a trade to stand on. It wasn't some grand gesture, just something that made sense. A way to make sure the right kind of men had a chance to learn something real, something that lasted. One day, Daniel came in with a stack of applications for the fund, fresh off the printer from the town office. He dropped them on the workbench, shaking his head. Didn't think we'd get this many. I picked up the stack, flipping through the names. One stood out. A kid with the last name Turner. I stared at it for a long moment, then set it down. Daniel watched me, waiting. You want me to toss that one? He asked. I shook my head. No. Daniel frowned. Even after everything? I met his eyes, steady. A man ain't his father. He nodded slowly, then went back to work. I sat down, grabbed the first form, and started reading. The forge fire crackled, the scent of hot metal thick in the air. Outside, the town carried on, the same as it always had. Some things break. Some things burn. But the fire? The fire keeps going. Winter settled into Ironwood Hollow the way it always did, creeping in slow, then taking hold like it meant to stay. The forge burned hotter to keep up with the cold, smoke curling into the sky, the sound of steel on steel ringing through the shop. The work never stopped, and neither did I. Daniel took on more responsibility, handling the smaller orders without me needing to watch over his shoulder. The kid had grown into the trade, steady hands, good instincts. I let him make his own mistakes, let him figure out how to fix them. That's how a man learns. One afternoon, he came in holding a newspaper, a crease between his brows. You see this? I set down my hammer, wiping sweat from my hands. Nope. He handed it over. The headline wasn't anything I hadn't expected. Disgraced historian facing legal action over fabricated work. Below it, a picture of Turner, looking smaller than I remembered. The article went on about lawsuits, academic boards pulling his name from publications, former colleagues turning their backs on him. The kind of slow, humiliating fall a man like that deserved. I skimmed it, set the paper aside. Huh. Daniel waited like he expected me to say more. When I didn't, he just shook his head, grinning. Cold, boss. Just finished, I corrected, picking up my hammer again. Later that night, Hector stopped by with a bottle of whiskey, 2 glasses, and a knowing look. We sat on the porch, the cold air biting, but not enough to make us move inside. He poured, I drank. Neither of us felt the need to fill the silence with nonsense. After a while, he finally spoke. Delilah's leaving town. I took another sip, let it settle before answering. That's so. Yeah. Heading south, from what I hear. Guess things didn't pan out the way she thought. I nodded, rolling the glass between my fingers. They never do. Hector watched me, waiting for something. Maybe some sign that it mattered. It didn't. She say anything before she left? He asked. I thought about it. About the quiet way she'd avoided me these last few weeks, like she wanted to say something but couldn't figure out the words. The way she'd looked at me that last time, standing in the cold outside the cafe, like she'd just then realized she was on the outside looking in. No, I said finally. She didn't. Hector exhaled, nodding like that was the answer he expected. He took another sip of whiskey, let the burn sit. You gonna miss her? I considered that for a second, really thought about it. Then I shook my head. I already did. A long time ago. That was the truth of it. The Delilah I married had been gone long before she packed up and left. Whatever feelings I had for her went with her. The next morning, I was at the shop before sunrise, stoking the fire, rolling up my sleeves, getting to work. The applications for the apprenticeship fund sat in a neat stack on my desk, waiting to be looked over. Daniel came in, rubbing his hands together against the cold. We still taking on one this season? I nodded. Two, actually. He whistled. Guess we're gonna be busy. That's the idea. I grabbed the first application, flipping it open. The last name Turner stared back at me. Daniel watched me, waiting. I set the paper down, looked at him. Tell him to come in next week. His eyebrows lifted. You sure? I just nodded. Like I told you. A man ain't his father. Daniel let that sit, then smirked. You got a funny way of making a point. I shrugged. Only way I know how. He shook his head, chuckling as he grabbed his hammer and got to work. The forge roared. The town carried on. And I did what I'd always done. Kept my head down, kept my hands busy, and let the fire burn.